Vesta stations retrograde the 25th of August, 2026. Hi, my name is Megan. I am a feminist Hellenistic astrology student. If you're here for feminism and Hellenistic astrology and mythology, you're in the right place. At Sippar, on the Euphrates, around 1880 BCE, a woman rolled her own cylinder seal across wet clay to close a contract that she negotiated herself. The tablet survives. So do thousands of others like it, and the women who sealed them held land, lent money at interest, hired labor, and went to court themselves. 400 years before that, at Ur, a high priestess of the moon god put her own name inside her own poems, which no one in any language we can read had done so before her. 700 years after Sippar at Thebes, a woman ruled Upper Egypt from a temple office, dated documents by her own years, wrote her name, and chose the woman who would rule after her. For roughly 1,000 years in the Greek world, would not go to war, found a colony, or sign a treaty without sending men across the sea to ask a woman at Delphi what she thought. That is 2,000 years of women holding property, running economies, governing territory, and deciding what states did next, and every one of those offices were a temple office. So what we remember is 6 women in Rome and a rule about their sexuality. Vesta is the last of them, and the one that was written down, and now the one that is minimized, and we talk about her chastity. Reading her as a story means reading the final chapter of something and mistaking the whole book. Vesta stations retrograde on the 25th of August, 2026 at 6:01 p.m. Universal Time at 27 degrees of Aries. She turns direct again on the 28th of November at 2:28 p.m. at 12 degrees of the same sign, so 15 degrees of ground covered twice over 95 days. She first crossed that 12th degree going forward on the 14th of June. So go back to the 14th of June. It's important. The material under review has been since then, and the ground is not fully clear again, and she's not fully out of shadow until the 10th of February, 2027. Through this whole time, she doesn't leave Aries. Vesta entered Aries on the 13th of May, 2026, and does not reach Taurus until the 16th of February, 2027, which is 9 months in one sign for a body that usually spends about 4. A stationing planet is at its slowest, and in Hellenistic astrology, what we say is the most concentrated. It is not moving backwards, and it never was. What a second pass describes is ground already covered and then being covered again. And in Vesta's case, the ground is what we made non-negotiable and what it has been costing us to keep. 4 other bodies are retrograde in Aries at the station. Neptune is at 3 degrees, Saturn is at 14, Pallas is at 22, and now Vesta is at 27. So the whole first person field of the chart is under a second look at once. As I said, my name is Megan. I am a feminist Hellenistic astrology student. I offer interpretations through the lens of feminism. If that resonates for you and that you like that, please follow along. Please do all the things. Follow, subscribe, notifications, hype, all the stuff. I would also really love to read for you, so please come for a reading. I love doing readings. I love meeting you. I love working with you. I love seeing your chart. I love looking to see what then a chart has then translated into your life and how your life then translates to the chart. You may want a reading for a number of reasons. Maybe you're just curious and you've never had one before. Maybe you just have never had a reading with me. Maybe you've never had a transit reading with me. All of those reasons are reasons to come get a chart reading. I also just recently started solar return readings, and I'm learning more and more about solar return readings. And I would love to do that if you have a birthday coming up, Or if your birthday is not coming up and you just want to look at the year ahead, we can do that. General readings, we could do pretty much anything. If you want me to look at a situation, if you want to know more about your birth charts, if you want to go deep into the asteroids and the goddesses, let's talk about that. If you want some natal reading, some birth chart reading, and some transit reading, we can do that too. If you want me to do synastry readings, I have in the past said that I wasn't really interested, and I'm learning. I'm learning, and I'm willing. If you're willing to have me kind of bumble through it for a chart reading, then I would like to do that as well. I am really just trying to see as many charts and meet as many of you as possible so that I can develop my own vocabulary on the things that I see and really like this means this and this means this and this is how this can manifest. And I just love meeting you and talking to you and hearing about your stories. Well, I also have a really great reading called the Lilith and the Lots reading, and that's about looking at the Arabic Lots and also Black Moon Lilith, and how do we access really our sense of creativity and passion and play in life, and then connect that to wealth. I also have 3 memberships on Buy Me a Coffee, so check those out, or just send me money on Buy Me a Coffee, because I would love that too. You can find it all in the description box or on my website. Before Rome, there was Hestia. And Hestia is not a story about a woman who gave something up. She is the eldest daughter of Kronos, who's now Saturn. The first he took and the last that he gave back, which makes her both the oldest and the youngest of the 12. Poseidon wanted her. Apollo wanted her. She went to Zeus. She put her hand on his head and swore that she would not marry. And in exchange, she took the first portion of every sacrifice that he made anywhere by anyone, and a seat in the middle of every house in Greece. So she knows what she wants. She was offered marriage to 2 of the 3 most powerful gods in the pantheon, and she came back with a counteroffer that gave her a permanent share of everything and a position that no one could remove her from. The Homeric hymn to Aphrodite says plainly that Zeus gave her a fine honor in place of marriage, and that she sits in the middle of the house and she takes the fat of the offering. She has almost no myth after that. The absence has been read as blankness, but what it really describes is a goddess against whom nothing could be done. There's no abduction story, there's no rape story, there's no jealous rivalry, there's no punishment. The rest of the pantheon generates narrative because its women keep being acted upon. They keep being victimized. Hestia settled her terms early, clear, and the record goes quiet. And so this is a closed negotiation, looks like from the outside. She reminds me of Shira 7, of knowing what exactly she wants, how to set it up, and then how to make sure that she is taken care of. Her fire is, her fire is the other thing. So every Greek household had a hearth. And every colony that left found a new city carried fire from the mother city public hearth to light the new one. So the fire in continuity is, rather than restraint, it's portable. And it had to be tended by someone or the whole line goes dark. Around 2300 BCE at Ur in southern Mesopotamia, a woman called Enheduanna was installed at Entu, a high priestess of the moon god Nana. She was the daughter of Sargon of Akkad. The appointment was political, and then she turned it into something else. She wrote, and her writing survives in temple hymns and a very long poem to Inanna, usually called the Exaltation. She put her own name in the text and described her own circumstances, which no one had done before her in any language. She is the earliest author in human history whose name is attached to her work, and she was a woman, and she was a priestess, and All of that is one fact. So there is a passage where she describes being driven out of the temple by an usurper called Luganae. And she says she was stripped of her office and made to walk out into the thorns. She does not appeal to her father or her brother. She appeals to Inanna directly in the poem. And she composes her way back into the office. How she writes is how she returns. Her hymns were copied in scribal schools for 500 years after she died, with her name on them, which is a longer run than most authors in any period of manage. Then Sumerian stopped being written, and the copying stopped, and she disappeared. Leonard Woolley excavated a carved alabaster disc in 1927 with her image and her name on it. It sat in a museum for decades before anybody worked out what it was that they were holding. Okay, now we go back to Sippar. So at Sippar on the Euphrates from around 1880 BCE, several hundred women at a time lived in a walled precinct called the Gagum, dedicated to the sun god Shamash, and they were called nadītu. They came from the highest families in the city, including the royal house. They did not marry, and they did not bear children. And they held property in their own names, bought and sold fields and houses, made loans at interest, hired labor, adopted heirs, kept their own cylinder seals, and sealed their own contracts, and went to court in their own persons. So we know this because the archives survive. Thousands of clay tablets in their own transactions with their own seal impressions. And this is the bookkeeping rather than something from temple relief, right? And it goes on for centuries. A woman entered the precinct with a dowry that stayed hers rather than passing it on to a husband. She invested the dowry. She lent to men in the city at interest. She could not have children, so she adopted a younger nadītu as her heir, which meant that property stayed inside the community of women, was matrilineal in the women, and compounded across generations rather than being redistributed out at each marriage. Whole categories of women's expertise has been transmitted and died with them. This one was written down on clay in an economy where writing something down was how it became enforceable. They actually ran a bank. In Egypt, from the 8th to the 6th centuries BCE, the office of God's wife Amun at Thebes was held by a woman who ruled Upper Egypt. Not influenced, ruled. She held estates. She commanded a household of officials. She dated documents by her own years in office. She had her name written in a cartouche and was depicted making offerings directly to the god in the way that a pharaoh is depicted. Amenderes the first and Shipar-wetet the second held the south while dynasties fought over the north. The succession is the part worth that we talk about. So the office passed by adoption. The sitting god's wife adopted her successor formally in a documented ceremony, and the successor was a woman that she chose. Nitocris, adoption, Stela records one of these transfers in detail: the arrangements, the estates, the income, and the personnel involved. So there was an office of political power in the ancient world, held by women, ruled by women, passed from woman to woman by deliberate choice, and secured by property settlements that were recorded in stone. It ended with the Persian conquest in 525 BCE, and it ended because the state that guaranteed it ended. That's where I stopped. I'm really interested in going further in this, and I have theories about how women are just better rulers. So we'll come back to that. Okay, the Pythia. For roughly 1,000 years, the single most consulted authority in the Greek-speaking world was a woman. As cities do not go to war without consulting the Pythia at Delphi, colonies were not founded, laws were not made, treaties were not signed. This is full of states sending delegations, receiving answers, and acting on them at enormous cost. The Athenians evacuated their entire city on the strength of one of her responses. She was, according to Plutarch, who worked at Delphi as a priest and knew her personally, a local, ordinary woman of respectable but unremarkable family with no special education. Plutarch says that she went in with a soul like a blank page. Then, look what the literary record does with her. She's written in as a raving, frenzied, unconscious of what she says, drug addict sometimes, as a vessel that men then interpret. The word that gets used in later sources is possessed. There's no evidence of any of this. The archaeology of the temple does not support the tripod over a chasm picture that most people carry. I've been there. It's on solid ground. It's on flat ground. It overlooks a valley, but it's not looking over. And the responses that survive are in verse, in meter, and are frequently very shrewd about politics. And the story that I hear is that she bathed in a mountain stream, which I drank from, my dog drank from, and then she ate a hallucinogenic, and then she answered the questions. Later, when Apollo came and took over, then it was turned into verse. Then her responses were turned into verse, and then Apollo's team then translated for her, instead of just allowing a ordinary woman over 50 answer the questions. So why none of the temple's women training survive? Every one of these had an apprenticeship and none of them survive. We know the nadītu women were literate because their letters are in their own hand. We do not have a single document describing how they were taught. We know the god's wife of Amun ran an administration, and we have the names of her stewards and no description of what she learned. We know that Enheduanna composed in a form that had rules, and we have the compositions, but we have nothing about the instruction. The Vestals are the exception. And it's only because a Roman antiquarian happened to find the legal procedure interesting. That's the only reason that we have it. So the service ran for 30 years, and it ran in 3 blocks of 10 years of learning, 10 years of performing the rites, 10 years of teaching the next intake. That's a formal curriculum with a stated duration, a practicum, a teaching requirement, held by women, staffed by women, in continuous operation for something close to 1,000 years. It ended when the college was abolished, and when it ended entirely. There's no manual. Nothing in the last generation of Vestals wrote down what she had spent 30 years learning, or if she did, no one copied it. So that is the pattern. The property is documented because property disputes go to court. The politics are documented because politics involve men. The knowledge is not documented, and the reason is not that these women could not write or were not literate, because they were. What was not written was what they knew, because no one with the resources to copy a text for 500 years thought that was the part that was worth copying, unfortunately. Then there's a story that the temple women had ritual sex with worshippers, and that this was the sacred feminine in its original form. The story comes from a writing around Babylon, a place that about a custom that he says required every woman to sit in the precinct once in her life. And his is a classical source that describes it, and he is describing foreigners. Julia Asante and Stephanie Boudin have gone both through the actual Mesopotamian material in the original languages and found that the terms translated as sacred prostitute in the 19th and 20th century do not mean that. They were consecrated women who worked as a wet nurse and in the healing rites. The nadītu, as in her own contracts show, was a financier. So neither word carries the meaning that is really attached to it, and the attachment happened in the translations. Now, if we put that aside next to the Vestals, so these two institutions of women with real independent power, one gets remembered as a woman who had sex for the temple, the other gets remembered as women who could not have sex at all. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, but we don't know, right? So it's the same thing run in both directions. So there's shame around not having sex at all, and then there's shame around having sex for the temple. It works both ways. Somewhere between the ages of 6 and 10, in front of witnesses, a Roman girl was taken by the hand by Pontifex Maximus, and he said one sentence to her. And I take you, Amata, to be a priestess of Vesta. At the end of that sentence, she was out of her father's legal power. She was not emancipated, which was a procedure with consequences. She was not transferred to a husband, which is the other route out and leads to the same condition, which is under a different man. She left patria postias. Altogether, kept every legal right that she had and acquired several that no one else in the city had. She could own property outright. She could write a will while her father was still living, which no other Roman woman could do. She could give evidence in court without swearing an oath, because her word was treated as sufficient on its own. Lictors walked ahead of her in the street, clearing a path, which was a magistrate's privilege and belonged to no other women anywhere in Roman law. And if she met a condemned man or woman on their way to execution, she could pardon them. They went free, and there was no appeal against her. 6 women at a time held that role out of a population of 1 million. Everything that the older offices had done at scale, Rome concentrated into 6 posts and put it in the gift of the state. 20 centuries of commentary have filed all of that under her body, and the word used is virginity. So what it describes is a woman who belonged to no man, and the Latin Virgo, which is as much a statement about ownership as anything else. Mary Beard published a paper in 1980 arguing that the Vestal was constructed out of pieces that did not belong together. She wore the senicrines and the 6-plaited hairstyle of a bride on her wedding day for 30 years. She wore the stola of a married matron, and she wore the suffibulum, which was hers alone. She was addressed with the vocabulary of a daughter at the moment of her taking, and then held none of the daughter's legal position. She had a magistrate's escort. Beard revised her own argument 15 years later, which is she is one of the few scholars who published a correction to herself in public, and the revision is even better. So her later reading is that the ambiguity was not a construction error, it was the point. The Vestal occupied a category that did not otherwise exist, and Roman law had no word for a free woman under no man's authority, so it built one out of spare parts. Robin Lorst Wildfrang works the legal side in detail, and the detail is where it gets really clear. The privileges are not honorifics. Testifying without an oath is a rule about evidentiary weight. Writing a will while your father is still alive is a rule about capacity. The lictors are a rule about precedence in a street where precedence was the entire social language. So, the Vestal's virginity was a legal condition dressed as a physical one. What she actually was holding was capacity, and Rome made her body the security. The Roman state believed that its own contuition depended on what these women did with their bodies. So is kind of interesting. It does not mean what it has been made to mean. Rome did not think that the Vestal's power came from abstinence. It thought that her power was real, her power was generative, her power was dangerous, and that it was being pointed at the state rather than at a household. The flower is the clearest evidence. So on 3 days in May, the Vestals cut, roasted, ground, and salted grain by hand to make mola salsa, and no public sacrifice anywhere in Rome could proceed without it. Every animal killed on every altar in the city carried something that these women made. So that's the generative power directed at a civic object, and the city understood it exactly that way. Also, just a note about the power being concentrated. The women that I've been speaking to, and I myself included, that have left relationships on purpose and are making the conscious decision to not be in a relationship, this is one of the main reasons why, because then the energy that would then be siphoned or turned into the household then can be sent into devotion, can be sent into the things that we are passionate about, into our intellect, into our creativity, into our future, where in previous times we sent that energy into a relationship, into the emotional labor of a relationship, into the physical labor of a household, and instead are using that for ourselves and consciously and intentionally using it, not because we can't find a relationship, because we choose to do this. The older temple offices have had the same structure without the trade-off. So the nadītu redirected the generative into property that compounded and got adopted heirs out of it. The god's wife of Amun redirected that energy into an office and passed the office to a daughter that she chose. So what Rome did take was the same arrangement and made the direction compulsory. Not your power is yours to spend, which is the older version, but your power is ours. And the price of holding it is that you can never spend it anywhere else. Devotion and desire were never opposites in these institutions. Hestia named her own terms and got the first share of everything. And so when I was in Greece, there are very few people who openly practice the 12, that they say, the 12 theism or the 12. The church has done a really good job of suppressing that and relating to any kind of worship of the 12 as bad and demonic. However, the people who do and the people who still maybe on the DL do something, what they will do is a crumb to Hestia, and it's the first crumb off of the plate. It's the best piece of meat, the best part of something, the best cake goes to Hestia. And that is that's the best way to ensure protection on the house, and then to ensure one's own abundance, at least from my limited experience around that. And that part still continues. But don't to ask someone if you honor the 12 or if you practice the 12, then everything will go quiet, and maybe just 2 because I was a foreigner. But Hestia survives. Now, concentrated and erotic creative force, which is aimed at something that the woman chooses, is all of what this is. It's everything that we're talking about, and is only from the outside. It is only in the retelling that the aiming really disappears. What is left is a rule about her body. So anyone sovereign being able to choose where it is that we direct our energy, where it is that we direct our erotic energy. And erotic does not have to do with just sexuality, but it's the creative energy. It's that spark of life. It's the fullness that we feel that brings forth everything else. Being able to direct that where we choose. In the Vestals, it turned into something that was a rule about her body. Twice in the worst years of the Republic, Rome dug up its own explanation for military catastrophe and found a woman. So after Kane in 216 BCE, with 50,000 Roman dead in a single afternoon, 2 Vestals were charged with breaking their vows. One was buried alive. The other took her own life before the sentence. Nothing about the battle had anything to do with either of them. What the city needed was a cause it could locate and then remove. And the Constitution had thoughtfully placed the continuity of Rome inside the Vestals' bodies, which made those bodies the obvious place to look. The punishment, a Vestal's blood could not be shed, so she could not be executed, but instead she was carried through the city on a covered litter and taken to Campus Sceleratus inside the walls and put into an underground chamber with a bed and a lamp and a little bit of bread and some tea. And the steps were removed and the ground was leveled over. The city could then say that no one had killed her, but she just died. Pliny the Younger describes one of these under Domitian 300 years later, and the tone of his letter is one of a man who suspects that the charge was manufactured, but watched it happen anyway. The privileges were real for as long as the state was comfortable with the Vestals, but when the state failed, the failure was then turned into the women holding the office, and then they received the punishment. And the end came by budget. In 382 CE, Emperor Gratian confiscated the revenues of the Vestals and the endowments of the temples. 2 years later, Symmachus, prefect of Rome, submitted a formal petition to have them restored, and Ambrose, bishop of Milan, argued against him and won. Symmachus makes the point that in the petition that is easy to miss, he notes what the Vestals actually cost the state, and it was very little. And he says the state had never before begrudged it. In 394, the fire was out. The last chief Vestal that we have a name for is Colia Cronia, and we have her name because a senator's widow paid for a statue. So there's one more scene of this. Zosmius records that Serena, niece of the emperor of Theodosius, went into the temple of the Mother of the Gods, took the necklace off the statue and put it on her own neck. An old woman, the last of the Vestals, was standing there and told her exactly what she had done and what would come of it, and Serena had her removed. She was strangled in Rome some years later at the Senate's instruction. Whether any of that happened, who knows? Zosmius put it down because he thought that it mattered, and he wrote it down. So why sovereignty is granted? Everything above is something real power, genuinely held, issued by an authority that also reserved the right to withdraw it. Audra Simpson, a Kanakwe Mohawk scholar, works this out in Mohawk Interruptus on a ground that is not Roman. The argument is her subject is a nation whose sovereignty is nested inside a state that claims the power to recognize it. Her point is that recognition and sovereignty are different, and that sovereignty, which depends on being recognized, has always been converted into something else. The moment the question becomes whether the larger authority will acknowledge you, the larger authority has won. Whatever answer it gives, the strength is not in the asking. Put the Vestal beside this, and everything kind of comes into focus. So she had the capacity that no one else in the city did, and she held it because the city said she held it. And the city said so in the form that included a chamber that she could die inside of. Every one of her privileges was an acknowledgement, and an acknowledgement that can be revoked by whomever issued it, whether or not it was true, but if then they needed someone to blame. So, let's see, en-heh-doo-AH did not petition to be reinstated. She composed, and the composition was the reinstatement. And then the poems outlived the office. The nadītu women did not seek an exemption from the property law. They built holdings inside of the property law and passed them to each other by adoption so that the holdings compounded. The god's wife adopted her successor and wrote the settlement into stone, which is a woman deciding who comes next instead of waiting to see who is appointed or who is born. Hestia does not ask for concessions. She states her terms, named her price, and then collected. So, we put the thing somewhere that it does not depend on anyone else's continuing goodwill. How is we decide, and then we act as though the decision is already settled, because that is what settled looks like. So why is it what women actually need? Because the alternative is a dispensation. And a dispensation is an offer, and the offer can be revoked. Devotion. Devoto in Latin is a legal and a religious act with a formula attached instead of just a state of feeling. Livy describes a Roman general at the Battle of Viserys in 340 BCE. With the line breaking, he called the priest over, put it on the ceremonial toga, stood on the spear, and repeated the words after him. He devoted himself and the enemy army together to the gods below. Then he rode into the enemy line and was killed, and the Romans won. So the grammar is the thing that I'm pointing out. So to devote is to transitive. It takes an object and a recipient. It binds immediately at the point of utterance, and the person who says it does not get to revise it. Devotion, in the older sense, is a vow with a shape, with one object named and everything connected to it permanently by decision. It is not discipline. Discipline is aimed at the self and measures itself by whether the self is compiled. Devotion is aimed outward at a thing that is not you. It is not service. Service responds to whatever need presents itself and therefore set by other people's requirements. The Vestals were not on call. They had one object and everything else was someone else's problem. And it is not obsession, which, obsession, that's something completely different. Every hour that those women spent produced flower that the city's entire religious calendar ran on. Vesta in a chart is where devotion concentrates. What has been made non-negotiable and what has been given up to keep it. It's a focus that costs something and that buys something. I'd love to hear in the comments how you have experienced devotion and devotion as you've aged and what occurs as devotion. I certainly have seen changes in myself. What was devotion was what was inherited either, right? What started out as devotion in maybe religion was inherited beliefs and then turned into what I heard over and over and over. And as I went into New Age spirituality was what I heard over and over and over. And so much of that New Age spirituality is just on repeat so many times that we start believing the things that we hear over and over and over and over. So is that really devotion? And then the time that I spent in the with the guru in the cult, devotion was turned more into a instruction and then the obsession, and really something of that was unmet in my attachment needs turned into then quote unquote devotion to a woman who filled a role in unattached, in my attachment needs. To now, then, what is devotion? It's a conscious choice to something outside of me. I use it in my recovery. I use it in my spirituality. And it's something that I choose. It's something that costs me something. And it's something that I do on purpose. I'd love to hear how you feel, experience, see, and choose devotion. how we see devotion in another person. So the Vestals, the fire had to be on, right? That's how we see it. That was the whole test, was the fire was still going. If the fire went out, then the Vestal on duty was beaten, and then the fire was rekindled, and then the method for rekindling was specified, and then the fire went on. So that's not how devotion is communicated. There's no declaration that devotion happens. Whether there's a fire that anyone enrolled could walk past and see burning, then that's the evidence of devotion, right? So why devotion is really impossible to see in someone and impossible to perform. We can describe our commitments, and but the description is not evidence of it. What is evidence is the duration. The water that's carried from the spring every day, that's discipline. So nobody's watching the water carry, but still that doesn't measure devotion. So the question is, how you can see devotion is you cannot. You can see it in a thing that's been going. You can see the impact of devotion. You can see the benefits of devotion over time, but there's no way to really see devotion in a person, and devotion does not equal discipline. Discipline does not equal devotion. So how does a busy woman make time for devotion? What they had was an object that couldn't be moved. So devotion is a decision about what's available for negotiation instead of just a time that we calendar. The fire is the most important thing that the Vestals did, but they also didn't have much else happening. They were not running businesses. They were not running families. They were not in a sandwich generation. They, in the sense of the being the most demanding or the most skilled. It was the thing that could not be traded against anything else. Everything else in the day arranged itself around a fixed point, and the fixed point was very, very small. Small is the point that gets mixed. So they're not grand acts, but they're not treated as grand acts. They're daily, they're brief, they're non-negotiable, and then the city's entire religious life stood on them because of what the Vestals were due. So a woman looking at a full week and asking where devotion goes is really asking the wrong question, because an hour is not the thing that she's looking for. What she's looking for is one commitment that stops being available to be moved the moment that someone else's urgency arrives. Like Hestia, setting the terms, setting her boundaries, period, that is it. It could be 20 minutes. It could be 20 minutes in a week. I'd say a day is more important, but what makes it devotion is that it has an object. And the object is not her getting better. It's not her proving herself. It's not finally feeling accepted, right? It's none of those things. It is immovable, no matter what happens, no matter who has something, no matter how urgent it is, no matter what. And that does not move. And then when the week gets difficult, the last thing that you want to do is the devotion aspect, and you still do it. So what the retrograde is going to open between the 25th of August and the 28th of November. So from the 25th of August, Vesta is going back over ground in Aries that she first covered from mid-June on. Aries is the plain first person, right? I want, I will, I go, I. It's force, and it's applied directly. It's and it's before anything guarantees what it will be met. So what is under a second look is what we decided unilaterally sometime from mid-June about what we would not be moved on. And the decision itself is not the question. What comes back around is what it has been costing, and whether that what the thing was aimed at is still the object. Maybe it needs to be a different object. 3 months is long enough for this to happen, and nothing about it is likely to arrive as an event. This is going to be the slow burn. It's also accumulating over time. It's most likely to show up as one commitment quietly going out and another one taking up the room that it leaves without a conversation. And 2 dates carry more. So Vesta reaches the point where she stops going back and turns forward on the 28th of November at 12 degrees, which is the same ground that she carried on the 14th of June. So the 14th of June, go back and look at that date, what was happening, look at your texts, look at your photos, look in your drafts. That's always the best thing for me, is to look at my drafts. So whatever was set in motion at midsummer gets the verdict rather than the review. And then the whole stretch is not finished. It's not out of shadow until the 10th of February, 2027, when she clears. So one thing about the sky, nothing above us is doing anything, right? Vesta turning does not reach around and rearrange our commitments. They're happening, they're reflecting, but the sky doesn't arrange it. So which rising sign is going to feel this, and for whom is it quiet? Aries is cardinal fire where it falls in the chart. And so for Aries, Cancer, Libra, and Capricorn, this lands on an angle. It is out in the open. It is attached to your life, and it will be more visible to other people, whether or not you want it to be visible. For Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, and Pisces risings, it lands in a house that holds and builds. So it's going to gather across the 3 months and increase in strength. Then for the fixed, for Taurus, Leo, Scorpio, and Aquarius, every part of this is in a quiet house. And that is, nothing is going to really show on the surface. This is going to be an interior slow burn, but it will be important. And then the fires, Aries, Leo, Sagittarius, you get this in your own language. Fire is the element that starts things without assurance being met. And a fire sign woman reviewing a commitment is reviewing something that she began herself alone with no one watching. So 6 women, 6 Vestals, had the only legal personhood available to women in Rome, and the city wrote the terms so the city could take it back. Every institution before them had the same power, but without the same clause. Women at Sippar wrote their own seals and their own contracts. A woman at Thebes choosing who would rule the south after her. A woman at Ur putting her name in the poem. And a goddess at the center of every house in Greece taking the first share of everything on terms that she wrote. The fire in the forum burned for something close to 1,000 years, and it went out because of a treasury decision in 382. And an argument in 384 was lost. Nobody stormed the temple, no drama, it just went out. So what has to be tended is the thing that goes out when it stops being tended. There's something in our lives that if we don't tend it, it goes out. And that's the entire definition. There's no version where it keeps itself light, where we can go back and forth to it and it doesn't really matter. There's no version where announcing it helps either. It just is. So all signs, somewhere around midsummer, you stop negotiating. There was something, there was no announcement, maybe even no conversation, you just didn't write it down, but there is a subject that used to be open in your life and is now closed. And you closed it, and everyone around you has adjusted to that without anyone really saying, hey, what happened? From the 25th of August to the 28th of November, that decision gets a repeat. So not to check whether you were right, you were right. The question that really opens is whether the thing that you made non-negotiable is still the thing that is non-negotiable, or whether you've been keeping a fire lit under something that moved out from it. So look at what you are holding. A standing arrangement with a person who's never been asked whether they still want it. Maybe a body of work that you haven't let anyone near, a house, a discipline when you took on when your life was completely different. It kept going because you kept going, and it just has never been reviewed, because reviewing it feels like disloyalty to what you were when you took it on. But you are no longer that person. So by the end of November, you're going to know which ones are alive and which ones have been running on you alone and which ones you can just drop. Don't necessarily need a conversation, don't need a ceremony, that you just drop and the fire goes out. The words for a woman who will not be moved are all faintly unpleasant, right? Rigid, difficult, married to it. The vocabulary is what the system produces about someone who it cannot renegotiate with, but it's not a report on your judgment. Whatever you have kept going, you kept going. No one issued that, which means that no one is in a position to take it back. Cancer rising. People credit you with being organized. It's not really the skill. The skill is that you can tell years ahead which things are still going to matter and which are going to be quietly abandoned by everyone. And you spend yourself only on the first kind. Aries is your 10th house. You work in the world, your view, your reputation, the version of you that goes around when you're not in the room. And what has been burning there is something that you started yourself with no permission and no runway, and you just did it. A practice that you built out of nothing, a role that you took because somebody had to and the volunteers were not there, a piece of work with your judgment in every part of it and your name on none of it, which you've never once complained about out loud. And it's been a light long enough that people have stopped asking when or how it began. In Rome, lictors walked ahead of the Vestals, clearing the street. That was the magistrate's escort, and no other woman in the city had one. What it meant was, on an ordinary morning, that her view arrived before she did, so she never had to establish herself in the room. The city gave her that. The city could also take it back. Between the 25th of August and the 28th of November, what your work is comes back around. So what most often moves in the 10th house is one long commitment ending without a scene, and it will just be one that you have argued for over a year ago. Late November brings a verdict on something that you set going at midsummer rather than another look at it. Your standing, your view was never the part in the question, and the people who ring you first when something has gone wrong have never once needed it explained to them. Leo rising. You concluded something about yourself at about 15, and it has been running as a policy ever since. You never have taken it back out and looked at it, and maybe it's time. Aries is your 9th house, so that's what you hold to be true. It's the distance that you cover. It's your higher education. It's where you go for travel, whether conclusions stay in your own hands. There's a position in there that you have held a very long time. It is well built. It is tested, which most people never do with anything that they really believe, and it has survived. Lately, you have been defending one part of it out of loyalty to the building that you did rather than to the argument itself, and you know which part that is. The Pythia at Delphi were ordinary local women. Plutarch worked at the sanctuary and knew them, and he says that their family were respectable and unremarkable, and they had no education to speak of. Cities went to war on what they said. Athens evacuated on what they said. Men crossed the sea to ask her a question and then spent a fortune acting on the answers, and then went home and told the story with themselves in it. The literature wrote her as a frenzied and unconscious of her own words, and that's the version that traveled around the world. From the 25th of August, where your conclusions come from, is what gets gone over again. If anything surfaces here, it will be one belief that you have defended for years, turning out to be someone else's and not yours. Absorbed very young, never argued for. Letting it go is going to cost less than you think. By the 28th of November, what's left is what you worked out yourself, what you believe. And there's more of it than you expect. This runs in a very quiet house for you, so this is internal, and no one is watching while this happens, but it's big changes. Virgo rising. You did something years ago that cost you more than anyone knows, and you would do it again. and you've been treating that as ordinary. Most don't. Aries is your 8th house, what runs between you and another person, who put what in and when, what was understood about the money, the flat, the business, the illness, the will, the years that it ran on your income, and everyone agreed that it was temporary. You have kept your side of an agreement that no one ever wrote down exactly for years, working on the assumption that being scrupulous would eventually become visible to the other party without your having to say a word. The Vestals kept the wills of Roman citizens in their temple. Caesar's was lodged there. Antony's was there. It was the safest archive in Rome because the women holding it had no stake in the contents and then could not be manipulated. Everyone in the city knew that. A man who wanted his last wishes to survive his own family walked them across the forum and handed them to the Vestals. From the 25th of August, the terms of an unwritten arrangement are going to come back up. What usually happens is that you say the thing out loud in a regular conversation with no reckoning or drama attached to it, and it goes considerably better than what you rehearsed in the car. On the 28th of November, it settles. The 8th builds really quietly, and it really doesn't really declare anything. So there's no moment that anyone can point at afterwards, and no version of this that you can describe to a third party as the event. You are already trusted with more of it than you really counted, and the person who tells you the truth first, before anyone else in that circle hears it, has been doing it for years. Libra rising, you get called difficult, believe it or not, about one specific thing, and it is the one thing that you've been right about all along. Aries is your 7th house, so whomever is across the table from you, the marriage, the friendship that's outlasted 3 cities, the person that you fell out with and still argue with in your head at 2 a.m., the opponent that you respect, you've been holding to a standard inside one of those relationships on your own continuously for years, and it has not occurred to you to check whether the other person is holding the same one, and it wouldn't occur to them to mention if they were not. Poseidon wanted Hestia. So did Apollo. She went to Zeus. She put her hand on his head, swore that she would marry neither of them, and took in exchange the first portion of every sacrifice made anywhere by anyone, and a permanent seat at the center of every house in Greece. 2 of the strongest offers in that world, and she came back with a counter. The record then goes almost silent about her. Very little else is written. The silence is not blankness. There was nothing further that anybody could do to her, so there was nothing to write about. From the 25th of August to the 28th of November, the terms get covered twice. On an angle in the open where you can't really manage the temperature of the room. If one thing shifts, it would be a standard that you've been holding yourself to, turning out to be the one that the other person never set and would be surprised to hear that you're doing. The last week of November is where it gets said instead of assumed, and a counterpart who argues back is the only kind worth having across from you. Look for those. Scorpio rising. We are very proud of something that everybody treats as completely ordinary, and we've stopped mentioning it because of how it lands when we do. Aries is our 6th house, the ordinary week, the body that gets us through it, the hours as we actually live them, then as we describe them at dinner. What we keep going there is small and daily. It's a 20-minute thing done every morning and done every morning for years that no one in our life could name if they asked. Nobody has ever thanked us for it because no one has ever seen it, and that was always the plan. The Vestals carried water every day from a spring outside the city in a vessel with a pointed base that could not be stood on the ground. It had to be held the whole distance or it was spilled. Nobody walked with her and no one checked. The only evidence she had done was that the rites happened later that day. From the 25th of August, the practice is under the eye rather than the week around it. So what survives a stretch like this is generally the smaller version. 20 minutes becomes 10 or 3 mornings instead of 7, and it holds at that. And holding at that is what we find out that works. We will read the shrinking as a failure for about 2 weeks before we notice that it didn't stop and we're fine. When she turns forward on the 28th of November, it is running again at whatever size it's settled on. All of this sits in a quiet house for us, and nothing shows from the outside. It only is seen from us. You've never finished it, and it has been held against you, mostly by you. Aries is your 5th house. What you make, because making it is good, the drawing, the garden, the instrument, the language that you're learning badly, the thing that you started at 31 and have never once described to anyone. You began it alone with nowhere for it to go. You kept it through the years when there's no reason to, and no one in your life would have noticed if you had stopped, including the people who say that they know you the best. No one has ever asked you for a progress report, and that's exactly why it has survived. On 3 days in May, the Vestals went out and cut the first ears of the new harvest by hand, and then roasted them and ground them and salted them. The result was called mola salsa, and no public sacrifice anywhere in Rome could go ahead without it. Every animal killed on every altar in the city carried flour that 6 women had made from their own hands. It was the least visible duty in the office, and the entire religious year of a city of 1 million people stood on that. From the 25th of August, the making runs a second time, in a house that gathers weight without announcing anything. The likeliest outcome is that someone is going to put it to use. Not about admiration or encouragement, use. So a person takes a piece of what you made and works it into their life, probably without asking. And then you find out sideways sometime in October from someone else. By the end of November, whether it is finished has stopped being the question anyone is asking. It has been in use for years while you were calling it unfinished. Capricorn, something got settled about you when you were very young in a house where the arrangements were not up for discussion, and you have been building on that ground ever since without going back down to look at what it was really made of. Aries is in your 4th house, the ground under everything, the house, the land, the line that you came out of, what's buried underneath all of it. The commitment burning there is to a place or somebody in your family that you took on for reasons that were good then, and that you've never renegotiated, because renegotiating would feel like a betrayal of whomever you were at the time. At the moment the Pontifex Maximus finished the formula, the girl passed out of her father's legal power and into no one's. She wasn't transferred, she wasn't released. With every right that she still had intact, she went to live in the Atrium Vestae with 5 other women, and it was hers to live in. That was the only exit from a father's authority in Roman law that did not walk straight into a husband. From the 25th of August to the 28th of November, this sits on an angle for you. It is out in the open, and it moves the whole structure when it shifts. So where this normally lands is that you find out what an obligation was really for, not what it was said to be for at the time, and not what you have been telling yourself ever since. Then you keep it on terms that you set, in a form that fits the life that you have now, rather than the one that you had it when you took it. On the 28th of November is where the new shape will hold. You carry weight without dramatizing the carrying, which is why almost no one knows how much carrying you are really doing. Aquarius. Aries is your 3rd house, the near traffic, the sister, the neighbor, the 5-minute walk, the exchange that you have 4 times a day and never get ready for. You are the one who always writes first. You are the one who remembers the date and the name of the doctor and which year the bad one was. There is a correspondence that you have carried single-handedly for years, and you know what would happen if you stopped, and you have not stopped. Enheduanna wrote at Ur around 2300 BCE and put her own name into her poems, which no one had done before in any language that we can read. Scribal schools copied her for 500 years later, and then Sumerian stopped being written. The copying stopped, and she went gone. A carved alabaster disc with her face and her name on it came out of the ground in 1927 and sat in a museum for decades before anyone worked out what they were holding. The world's first named author was cataloged and shelved. From the 25th of August, the question is whether you have been carrying both ends. So what normally happens next is that the other person writes first, unprompted, about something that matters, and it revises what you thought the whole thing had been for years. What is left after the 28th of November is a shorter list and a better list. This runs in a very quiet house for you, so no one will comment on it, and no one else will really see it at the time. Pisces rising. Aries is your second house. What's yours, your money, your hours, your equipment, the things in your possession. What you have not let go out is a rate that you set or a limit on what you will take. And you've held it without moving for longer than most people hold anything, though through at least one stretch where moving it would have been easier and it would have worked. At Sippar, from around 1880 BCE, several hundred women at a time lived in a walled precinct and held property in their own names. They bought land, they made loans at interest, they kept their own cylinder seals, they sealed their own contracts and went to court in their own persons. They adopted each other as heirs, and so the holdings stayed inside the community of women and compounded across generations instead of being redistributed out at every marriage. Thousands of their tablets survive because they wrote everything down and sealed it, and a sealed tablet is enforceable in a way that a promise or a story is not. From the 25th of August to the 28th of November, what is yours gets looked at instead of defended. The available move is that something you own and have been carefully preserving gets used instead. The good equipment is taken out of the box. The money that has been the money that has been sitting there spent on the thing that it was always supposed to be spent on, the hours are released. And in the final week of November, something that you had on the list to give up gets kept instead. And you have never hardened yourself in exchange for being safe, and you've had the reasons and the chances to do so. Aries. Aries is your first house, and this is your own sign. So the station on the 25th of August at 27 degrees sits on you. Your first house is your person, your body, your presence, your personality. There's something about how you live that you decided by yourself and have never once put up for consultation. Not a preference, it's a term. And it has not gone out, and you've never really explained it to anyone who asked. A whole of the Vesta's independence rested on one sentence spoken over a child in front of witnesses. I take you, Amata. At the end of it, she was out of her father's power and under no one's, and everything else followed from that single utterance. The property, the will, the evidence taken without an oath, and the escort clearing the street. One sentence, said out loud, in public, with full legal effect from the moment it finished. From the 25th of August, this sits on you in the open for 3 months. The probable version is that the term stops needing stating because the way that you are living has become obvious enough that people stop asking. Somebody who used to query you goes quiet on the subject, and the going quiet is an event. From the 28th of November, it holds without defending. Going first has never gotten easier for you, which means every single time is a fresh decision made rather than a habit that you fall into. And that is a very different thing from confidence and much more rare. Hi, Taurus. Aries is your 12th house, what runs out of sight, the interior work with no audience, the hour before the house is awake, the thing that you have never handed over. You have been making something alone in there for a long time, early mornings or the hour after everyone has gone to bed, and it is good. Almost no one has seen it, and its being unseen isn't an oversight or an accident of your scheduling. Vesta had no image. There was no statue in the temple in the forum, which visitors from other cities found strange enough to remark on, and Cicero found strange enough to mention. There was fire, and that was it. Every other cult in the city had a statue that you could go and stand in front of on the right day of the year. This one had a flame that had to be tended. It had to be continuously present, and the difference between the two is that the statue keeps without anyone there. From the 25th of August to the 28th of November, the private material gets crossed twice in the quietest house on the wheel. 9 times out of 10, what this brings is more hours rather than a viewer. The thing gets given time it hasn't had in a stretch of the year where other demands seem to drop away, and it advances a long way with still no one knowing. After the 28th of November, you stop asking whether it was worth doing. What you wanted out of that house was never an audience. It was hours with no one watching that count as work when they are finished. And you can see from the results that they do.